Okay, now some of you were here before when Paul and I spoke to you last time about animism. Animism is about communing with the spirits of nature. And if you've read our book, you'll know even more about how we view that. Modern alchemists, such as Graham Harvey, use the word persons instead of spirits. The world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and our task is to learn how to live with them. Now, what is alchemy is a much more difficult question to answer. That could be a whole talk in itself, because I believe that to understand what alchemy is a big chunk of beginning the work. I can't hear myself. Can you really hear me? Okay, so even if you feel you know what alchemy is, what I'm about to say might confuse you because it's a bit different. Of course, it is and always has been different things to different people. But let's start with some of the definitions that people have found adequate over the centuries. The attempt to transmute lead into gold. The attempt to purify or heal the soul through transformation by the use of symbols. The search for the philosopher's stone, which creates gold and brings immortality. The investigation of the natural world, including metals, which led to modern science. Now, I believe that all of these are incomplete definitions. For me, a better one is manipulation and changing of natural materials, especially by fire, while at the same time consciously working to perfect both the spirits of the materials and your own spirit. Despite all of those other definitions, much of alchemical writings, from the earliest times until today, has stated or implied that definition. But we'll come back to that in a minute. There's evidence that the earliest humans, even the Neanderthals, saw certain rocks as gifts dropped from the sky by the gods. Meteorites, obviously, because they could see them fall in a blaze of light. Gold, because it shone like the sun and might even be a piece of the sun fallen to earth. Due to the heat of their entry, meteorites often contained smelted metals, and people quickly worked out how to use those to make things that were useful and beautiful. These rare magical gifts were considered sacred in themselves and seen as being alive with their own spirits. Much later, people realized that those same metals could be found deep within the earth if you applied a mysterious process involving fire and a great deal of magical skill to a certain sort of ordinary rock. These metals were thought to be living things that were given birth by the earth. Blacksmiths were viewed with awe and a slight fear in the same way that shamans were. And because both could engage the spirits of plants or metals to help or to harm. And clearly, this is animism, an intuitive connection with nature, interacting with the spirits all around you in the landscape. But it's also the primal basis for a sort of proto-alchemy. The first step, in fact, was earlier with the discovery of firing clay for pottery. With time, processes for painting, dyeing, glassmaking, and metallurgy brought us even closer to alchemy. When Homo faber, that's man the maker, begins to work with fire and earth, alchemy is beginning. When Wayland and Vulcan are added to the company of gods, and when the village blacksmith can magically transmute the spirits of rock into metal objects, we're approaching alchemy. In fact, animism helps us answer that age-old question of whether alchemy is physical transmutation of metal or instead the quest for the perfection of the soul. Historically, each side of that question had many students and many practitioners, and the answer has differed in different times and places. But the essence of alchemy, across time, and certainly in the West, is that if it does not include both, then it's not alchemy. There's plenty of other words you can use, metallurgy or chemistry for the manipulation of materials, transformation, growth, or a dozen others for the spiritual quest. Alchemy is the meeting of the two. But the really vexing question, which haunted me for years, is what in the world does that actually mean? How can it be both? What is the link that makes metallurgy or chemistry into a quest of the soul? The answer is animism. Alchemy relies on the alchemist's relationship with the spirits of matter in order to pursue spiritual growth for them both as a unifying process performed through the manipulation of that matter. Alchemy is inherently and unavoidably animistic. So how and where did it take on its full-blown form, moving on from the earlier magical blacksmithing? Well, for millennia, alchemists have told us it began in ancient Egypt. Let's start with the word itself. The al was added by Arabic writers to a much earlier Greek word, chemia, which may be related to the words for liquid, pour, cast, and alloy. But the older answer, which is still considered possible, is that chemia itself comes from chem, the old name for Egypt. Chem itself originally meant black or dark, and specifically referred to the fertile lands of the Nile compared to the red lands of the surrounding desert. And the love of meanings based on wordplay and punning, which is millennia old, makes it possible that both of these are actually true, that the art of casting and making alloys that came from Egypt. But if indeed it means the Egyptian art, what did the Egyptians do? Modern scholars, steeped in dogmatic classicism and not able to see beyond Greece and Rome, saw only the similarities with Greek philosophy. So they dated it to later Hellenized Egypt, which is also the source of our earliest surviving written records of true alchemy. To these scholars, animistic thinking meant primitive, and so they could not see the unifying animistic base that marked alchemy as something ancient. They assumed that the early writings insistent on the Egyptian origins were part of the classical romanticization of Egypt. But that's a funny thing. It seems that every so often, ancient Egypt gets romanticized. The Greeks did it, the Romans did it, early Muslim scholars did it, the Renaissance did it. It happened in the 18th century, the 19th century, the 1930s, the 1970s. You think maybe there is something actually quite special about Egypt? Anyway, there certainly is as regards alchemy. I was blown away when I discovered a little-known historical fact, which has really only been properly understood quite recently because of new archaeological discoveries and translations. In Hellenistic, that is later Egypt, there were metallurgists who were temple priests. Their job was to create images of the gods and to make those the most beautiful, unique, and skilled creations possible through the constant discovery of new techniques. But furthermore, in order to make an image worthy to hold the part of the spirit of a god, it was necessary to perfect, that is, to purify, remove all the impurities from the metal, the spirit of the metal, and the metallurgist priest, him or herself. The practices and rituals were carefully laid out to do this. This is the origin of true alchemy. The connection between physical manipulation and spiritual attainment was inherent in the process. We know this from a few surviving writings from around the 3rd or 4th century AD, many of them by Zosimus of Panopolis. He was a metallurgist priest and is sometimes called the father of spiritual alchemy. But recent discoveries have made it clear that he was not writing down his own original ideas, but rather was an archivist in charge of preserving the ancient sacred knowledge. In 2003, thousands of ostraca were found in the Temple of Repit at Arthropus. Ostraca are texts carved into fragments of broken pottery, an early example of recycling. Alongside of a lot of other new information were inscriptions strongly suggesting that the same system of creating living statues of the gods with the same techniques and religious underpinnings had existed within the temples for centuries, maybe millennia. Let's put that another way. The unified pursuit of manipulation of metals, chemicals, and dyes, alongside the quest to perfect the spirits of those materials, while at the same time spiritually perfecting the operator, in other words, alchemy, appears to be a very ancient process with roots deep in ancient religious practice. So it seems to me that even to ask the question of metal versus spirit is a fundamental misunderstanding of alchemy. It's easy to see how our Western dualistic worldview has led to this misunderstanding. Dualism is the belief that spirit is separate from matter, and the idea is closely bound up with our separation from nature. But ancient humans thought in a unified, monistic framework, as do some cultures today. Spirit and matter were aspects of one universal substance. Gradually, both dualism and our separation from nature arose and in some parts of the world took hold. Many classical philosophies saw spirit as much superior to matter, and Christianity helped to cement that idea. Hundreds of years later, the Enlightenment reacted to this by going to the opposite extreme. The rise of science gave us the view that there is only matter, and spirit is just superstition. This is the world we were born into, and the balance is only now just starting to return in a more animistic, monistic way, where spirit becomes consciousness and can be seen as an integral part of matter. We're just beginning to come full circle, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So, the central Hermetic doctrine, as above, so below, is a remnant of that ancient monistic thinking. Hermeticism is another vast subject that deserves a separate talk, but briefly, it is a philosophy, probably also rooted in ancient Egypt, which sees spirit, matter, God, nature, and humanity forming a fundamental unity. Hermeticism has been kept alive by small groups throughout Western history and still forms the basis of most training in ceremonial magic, and thus has influenced Wicca and many other aspects of modern neo-paganism. Behind the scenes, it has strongly influenced mainstream thought, including scientific heroes such as Galileo and Newton. Interestingly, a number of aspects of cutting-edge science are coming to the same conclusion without direct influence. This includes some of quantum theory, and especially panpsychism, the growing scientific theory that everything in the universe is conscious. Woohoo, animism. And again, panpsychism is another whole interesting thing in itself, and it's gaining ground. So while alchemy may appear to be an urban, erudite pursuit of unnatural ends, it is instead closely bound up with the living earth. It doesn't work without a strong bond to the spirits of earth. It is, in fact, an ancient animistic devotional practice. So in my view, that's what alchemy is all about. You may be thinking that this picture leaves out the most basic things that you've always been told about alchemy, specifically the Philosopher's Stone and the arcane and archetypal symbolism. So what's happened to immortality and changing lead into gold? What has ancient Egyptian practice got to do with the Philosopher's Stone? Well, very little, it turns out, even though the term Philosopher's Stone was first used by our friend Zosimus. Making other metals appear to be gold or silver is even older. Babylonian recipes say that their process could fool an artisan, but Egyptian sources are not trying to deceive, but instead to maximize the beauty and worthiness of the god statues. True transmutation was a later question, discussed by Aristotle. He theorized it should be possible based on the theory of the four elements. But few people concerned themselves with it until the Islamic period of alchemy. Later, of course, it became a sort of mania in Europe when kings began to imprison alchemists to make gold to order. The pursuit of bodily immortality came to be part of both Western alchemy and of Taoist alchemy in China, but in both cases, the original concept was of long life and the creation of an immortal spiritual body. Taoist ideas probably did not reach the West until the 8th century in any case, but a misunderstanding of the story of Osiris, which was closely connected to Egyptian alchemy, may also account for the confusion. I'll mention in passing that Taoism itself is an abstract elaboration of animism, and its text, the I Ching, teaches wisdom by relating all the concerns of humanity and spirituality to the spirits of mountain, lake, and sky. Islamic alchemy was also concerned with long life through good health and the treatment of disease, mainly through plant alchemy. So neither concept was part of the origins of alchemy, but came much later and helped it to become twisted into something despised and scoffed at by most people. Strange and obscure symbolism, on the other hand, is a part of ancient alchemy. There is a Babylonian recipe which is called the crab or scorpion formula, because one of the ingredients, which we can't identify today, is a glyph, which looks like a crab, or in some inscriptions has the tail of a scorpion. This is a kind of shorthand and developed into glyphs such as the planetary signs used in a horoscope. Other Babylonian recipes use verbal imagery to describe different substances. This type of symbolism is more puzzling. The recipes were far too well known for this to be an attempt at secrecy. And they're not shorthand because the terms are longer than the true name. The most likely answer seems to be it's the kind of wordplay that we saw in Chem, which was also employed in Akkadian. If words look or sound alike, there is a hidden relationship between their meanings. And of course, those relationships will be lost in translation. Modern scholars are not the first to think that genuine bile of mongoose was an ingredient used to dye metals, but further linguistic study showed it was a type of copper. Even where alchemists did uncover the true meanings, it would have lost its original linguistic basis and would appear to be allegory or colorful symbolic language. Gradually, this became an end in itself, especially when secrecy was needed, either to protect trade secrets or to protect the practitioner from persecution. Symbolic thought is certainly as old as our earliest surviving written story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there's evidence of ritual practice suggesting that the very earliest humans used symbolism. The Greek Stoics, whose thinking had a surprising influence on Hermeticism, believed that these first men had a strong understanding of the cosmos beyond the five senses and what we have, which could only be expressed through symbol and allegory. Their theory could well have contributed to the later value given to symbolism. The picture is worth 1,000 words. Several famous Renaissance alchemical texts are wholly or partly consist in pictorial symbolism. But I would also speculate that for many alchemists, these symbols had an element of reality. Bile of mongoose and the later dragons, androgynes, griffiths, lions, and so forth that fill alchemical texts were in some degree an attempt to express the living spirit essence of the substance being worked with, and of the processes and the reactions which each had their own living spirits. More recently, some people have been attracted to alchemy primarily because of this symbolism. C.G. Jung came to the conclusion that this was in fact the essence of alchemy, its true meaning and purpose for psychological transformation. For a brief period in the 17th century, one Christian mystical branch of alchemy believed the same, and he used that as a source. It's indeed a fascinating and often beneficial mine of meaning. It also provided a comfortable understanding for the modern mind. Alchemy had been solved. The true alchemist, however, is not only dealing with symbolism. He or she pursues spiritual development through experimentation with actual substances, chemical, mineral, vegetable, metallic. The stated aim of the alchemists was to replicate, to participate in, to immerse themselves in the creative processes of the natural world. Now, you all know about correspondences, the matching up of colors, planets, plants, metals, and so forth. Probably you've used them in magical workings. Today, we can't really appreciate how fully the very essence or spirit of, for example, the sun, and the very essence or spirit of the color gold and the metal gold were thought to be the same thing. To work with gold was to partake in the spiritual essence of the sun, and sun symbolism was also reality. So where does this leave us in today's world? Perhaps it's not possible to be a true alchemist. Only a few highly trained scientists can hope to make new discoveries or invent new substances. But there are many ways to seek out a more intimate spiritual relationship with the actual persons of Earth. Persons or spirits, you can define either word in a way that makes sense to you. One way to seek that relationship is by working closely with those persons to create beauty or usefulness, as our ancestors have done forever. Some of you may already find clay or plants or metals to be sympathetic persons that you have come to know well and could perhaps get to know better. There's a wonderful book, Metal Never Lies, written by a pagan blacksmith in my home state of North Carolina. I'm sure he never thinks of himself as an alchemist, but his animism is unmistakable. Inspirational and very practical, it gives instruction on how to work metals in this unified spiritual material way. I've got a copy here if anybody wants to see kind of what I'm talking about how he explains it. I hope to undertake some of this work myself, which is not intuitive for me. In my more familiar territory of the mind, I am working hard on my book about all of this, which I hope to have out later this year. But my aim is twofold: to bring a greater understanding of our history as animists, and to inspire animistic practices to help erase from our minds the false division between matter and spirit. Thank you.